Well, good evening, everybody. It's Alex Trezolio. Welcome to week 6 of Introduction to the Middle Way. So as usual, let's briefly review what we did last week. As you may recall, last week was all about establishing that the self of the person does not truly exist. And we did this by examining the idea of the self, which is what we cling to, and showing that it is baseless. And we saw that because the idea of the self is baseless, not only does it mean that there's no truly existing self of a person, but it means we can choose a different idea of the self. We can reinvent ourselves as a Buddhist, as a bodhisattva on the path, as a deity if we're doing sadhana practice. And this is not easy, but it's doable. The second thing we talked about was conventional truth collapses upon analysis. As we said, if we analyze the conventional truth, all elaborations cease. All thought, all language collapses. And so partly as a result of that, Chandrakirti does not seek to analyze the conventional. He just follows the consensus of everyday people. Another thing we came across is the idea of the horse practice and the donkey practice, Padampa Sanjay's idea. And here Rinpoche said, you start with a very emotional, devotional kind of practice, praying to the Buddha, thinking he's in front of you, visualizing him clearly, and with a subject and an object, tears in your eyes, all of that. And then, suddenly you remember that Buddha is emptiness. Buddha is not separate from your mind. There is no truly existing Buddha. And then, you don't know what to do, because your devotion disappears, the tears stop, the yearning, the longing stops. And Padampa Sanjay said, when that happens, it's like riding a horse. And then for many of us, what we think is, oh, I want to get back to my old model, my devotion. And then, of course, you seek to bring back the Buddha, all the emotion, crying. And Padampa Sanjay says that is like dismounting the horse and riding the donkey. Okay, so that's going to be important to us this week, because this week we're really focused on the emptiness of emptiness, right? Non-duality. And we're also going to start asking, well, what does that mean for our practice? So we'll start by completing chapter 6, verses 179 to 226, concluding with a lovely verse, which is about how the king of swans will spread his broad wings that are the two truths, the wisdom and skillful means, and lead the other swans to liberation. So that's where we're going to end up. After that, we'll turn to the Heart Sutra, and where I'll go through some of the teachings Rinpoche gave in Kathmandu earlier this year, in April, May. And along the way, we'll pause just for a little practice, because as we've been saying many times, we can't understand non-duality except through our meditation. So this week, I'm not going to try to rely on words alone. Okay, so for the 10 bulls, we're number 8, the bull transcended. Whip, rope, person and bull, all merge in no thing. This heaven is so vast, no message can stain it. How may a snowflake exist in a raging fire? Here are the footprints of the patriarchs. Comment. Mediocrity is gone. Mind is clear of limitation. I seek no state of enlightenment, neither do I remain where no enlightenment exists. Since I linger in neither condition, eyes cannot see me. If hundreds of birds strew my path with flowers, such praise would be meaningless. Okay, so that's where we're going to end up. And as you may know, the image that goes with that verse is just the Enso. Yeah, so very beautiful, the sort of encapsulation of non-duality. But when we think of the hero's journey, before we can get to our goal, we have to go through a big struggle. And actually, many of you this week have been talking about and expressing that struggle. Many of you, as you seek to engage in these teachings of Madhyamaka, it brings up a certain kind of nihilism. It's a version of the questions, well, if everything is emptiness, why bother? Why do anything at all? If everything in conventional truth is just like a magical illusion, then why does any of it matter? If there is no truly existing suffering, why should I seek to help suffering beings? Of course, if there's no enlightenment, why should I practice? So it's very easy to get caught in these doubts, right? And this was a big challenge in Western philosophy as well for the existentialists. And in particular, though he didn't call himself an existentialist, for Albert Camus, who wrote on suicide, for example, in the myth of Sisyphus. As you may know, Sisyphus was a figure in Greek mythology who was condemned to repeat forever the same meaningless task of pushing a boulder up a mountain, only to see it roll down again. Yeah, so the sense of meaninglessness, absurdity. And what he wrote, he said, there is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Deciding whether or not life is worth living is to answer the fundamental question in philosophy. All other questions follow from that. And he sees this question of suicide as a natural response to the underlying premise that life is absurd. In several ways, right? It's absurd to seek meaning when there is none, and it's absurd to hope for some form of continued existence after death. And Camus also thinks it's absurd to try and know or understand or explain the world, because he sees the attempt to gain rational knowledge as futile. He says, that universal reason, practical or ethical, that determinism, those categories that explain everything, are enough to make a decent man laugh. So I guess from Chandrakirti's point of view, you could say he's done, a job of deconstruction, right? He's established that the form is emptiness, right? He's shown there is no truly existing eternalistic meaning. But he's now truly lost. And far from being unusual, this kind of fight with our demons is an essential part of the hero's journey, right? It's where we are fighting with those last remnants of the old self, right? This baseless story of the self that we used to tell ourselves and that doesn't want to be rewritten. And if you look at the hero's journey itself, in Joseph Campbell's version, his version has 17 stages, but his stage number 9 is called Atonement with the Father. And he says, here the person must confront whatever holds the ultimate power in his or her life. It doesn't have to be a male, just something or someone with incredible power. Of course, as we know, the strongest demon is our ego. Stage 10 for him is apotheosis, right, climax. And he says, when someone dies a physical death or dies to the self to live in spirit, he or she moves beyond the pairs of opposites to a state of divine knowledge, love, compassion, and bliss. So, interesting. He was writing in a very different tradition, but this idea of transcending pairs of opposites, very similar to our idea of non-duality. A different version is Blake Snyder, who has a 15-stage version, and his number 10 is bad guys close in. Doubt, jealousy, fear, physical and emotional foes regroup to defeat the main character's goal. And the main character's great situation disintegrates. Number 11, all is lost. The main character realizes they've lost everything they gained, or everything they now have has no meaning. Well, that feels a little bit like what we're doing, right? I mean, we spent all these weeks refuting all these different positions, refuting all these views, to end up at a place of emptiness where there are no views. But now it seems that we end up refuting our own stories as well. You know, we have no way of making sense of the way forwards anymore. So, you know, the main character then hits bottom and only comes out with some kind of fresh idea or inspiration or thematic advice from the B story. And then he chooses to try again. And actually, it's very similar to the Buddha's own life story, right? As Joseph Campbell noted, the classical story also follows the structure of the hero's journey quite closely. And for the Buddha, he has to confront Mara and his daughters before enlightenment. So Mara was a demon, the lord of death. And his name means destruction. He represents our ego, our emotions, our ignorance. And, you know, when Siddhartha was sitting beneath the Bodhi tree about to attain his enlightenment, Mara brought his most beautiful daughters to seduce him. That tanha, craving, arati, aversion and discontentment, and raga, attachment and desire. But Siddhartha remained unmoved in his meditation. And then Mara brought vast armies of monsters to attack him, and yet still Siddhartha sat still, unmoving. Then Mara claimed that the seat of enlightenment rightfully belonged to him and not to the mortal Siddhartha. And all of Mara's demon soldiers cried out, "I am his witness." And Mara turned to Siddhartha and said, "Who will speak for you?" In a very famous moment, Siddhartha reached his right hand to touch the earth, and the earth itself spoke, "I bear you witness." Mara disappeared, and as the morning star rose in the sky, Siddhartha realized enlightenment and became a Buddha. So yeah, maybe for us, maybe we can see our own hopelessness, our own depression and nihilism as a manifestation of Mara. Now Chandrakirti, because he's giving a view teaching, he doesn't really give us much practice advice. Right, so we'll have to talk about that separately. But one thing we will see today, actually from the commentary, is one thing that's very important is compassion. Right? So if whatever may be happening with our emotions, with our sense of hopelessness, we can never give up on our compassion. And also, we'll understand a little more about why Chandrakirti praised compassion at the beginning of chapter 6. Why is it the most important thing for us in this chapter? And also this sense of hopelessness, right? This sense that we can't make sense of where we're going. As Rinpoche would often say, that's another reason why it's so important to generate merit. And as you recall from the beginning of this chapter, in verse 4, which we covered in week 2, to whom should the Madhyamaka be taught? And if we're the kind of students that when we hear these teachings on emptiness and the middle way, we have tears in our eyes, the hairs on our body quiver, then yes, we should be given the full teachings on the emptiness of the person and the emptiness of phenomena. But if we don't respond that way, then we need to collect more merit. As we've been saying all the way through, practice, accumulating merit, really is 98% of the Madhyamaka. So the text today is actually, the structure is fairly simple. So 179 to 223 We're going to explain emptiness as it is to be realized by the Mahayana, and that corresponds to the logic tree number 12 of the structural outline. And the last three verses, 224 to 226, they are a summary of the qualities attained. Remember, we're accomplishing the parameter of wisdom here, so that's what we attain at the end of the sixth bhumi once we have completed and perfected that parameter. So 179 starts by saying, the Buddha taught emptiness in two ways, through the selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena. It's actually a very straightforward verse. In fact, most of the verses today are pretty straightforward. Most of them simply are a list of the different kinds of emptiness realized by the Mahayana. Rinpoche didn't give much commentary when he taught these, so I'm actually going to be dipping into Mipam's commentary a little today from the Padmakara translation of this text. And actually, even in Mipam Rinpoche's commentary, there's only really two significant sections, but they're both quite important. So one is on this verse, and he asks, do the Shravakas realize the non-self of phenomena? Now, we have covered this before, for example, with the baby prince and the ministers, which was verse 8 of chapter 1, week 2. And the idea is, as we said, to attain samsara, we have to remove our emotional defilements, which means we need to realize the selflessness of the person. Otherwise, you can't get rid of the notion of innate I, which is what we cling to. And since ultimately the self of the person and the self of phenomena are no different, the selflessness, I should say, you can also say that the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, they must realize the selflessness of phenomena. As Mipam says, it is rather as if when somebody drinks a mouthful of seawater, one cannot deny that he is drinking the sea. So the question is, well, if they realize then the emptiness of the person, why don't they also realize the emptiness of phenomena? And there are three reasons. Firstly, their interest. Right? The Shravakas, their only interest is in getting out of samsara. They're not necessarily aspiring to liberate all sentient beings. And then the presence of internal and external conditions, right? So the internal condition is, have they cultivated compassion and aspiration? And the external condition is, have they met a teacher of the Mahayana? Now, the non-existence of the personal self is what Miham calls a non-affirming negative, right? It's not the emptiness of everything, including the emptiness of emptiness. And the emptiness of everything is beyond 32 misconceptions, one of which includes clinging to this non-affirming negative, right? Migak. Now, of course, the Prasangika, they use this approach, but they don't cling to it. So, if one is on the Shravaka path, there is a real danger that our attachment to nirvana could become a version of this. The Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, they won't realize their fruit unless they fully understand the emptiness of the person. And so we can conclude that the Madhyamaka must be common to all three vehicles. Actually, we saw this already in verse 79, chapter 6. So there really is only one final vehicle. And yet we also know that when studying Madhyamaka, some become bodhisattvas and Buddhas, others just Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. So what's the difference? Well, we say elsewhere that nirvana is peace, right? That's the fourth seal, the fourth mudra. So Prajnaparamita is the realization of the evenness, the equality of samsara and nirvana. That transcends the extremes of either existence, samsara, or peace, right? Nirvana as cessation. And if you don't have this equality, right, if, like the Shravakas, you have some preference for nirvana, then that ends up meaning you have a view, and it becomes an extreme view with some kind of belief, some kind of truly existing belief. Bear in mind, Chandrakirti, he has no views. And so if then the difference is not in the view itself, what is the difference? And here it turns out the true causes of Buddhahood, according to Mipam, are compassion and the accumulation of merit. Right? So yes, the first 7 bhumis are also common to Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, but once we get beyond them, our compassion and our merit will take us to enlightenment. And this is why in the Mahayana, bodhicitta is stressed so heavily. And as Rinpoche said, right, even being a scholar, right, especially a scholar who has no bodhicitta, you may know every aspect of the Madhyamaka teachings, but unless you have cultivated that bodhicitta, it's going to get you nowhere. Mipam continues, if you supposedly realize non-duality, but you're still drawn only to the extreme of nirvana, it means you don't actually realize the equality of all things. And even if you realized the luminosity of the uncontrived nature of mind, you could still fall into the extreme position of the Shravakas. So that's why we're going to emphasize throughout today the union of the two truths. Right? The Dhammadhatu, the greater quality which does not reject samsara, and nor does it abide in the peace of nirvana, because it is fully endowed with enlightened activities. So, just very good to contemplate on this, just as practice advice for ourselves. Has our practice become overly focused on some kind of inner accomplishment? Or are we actually practicing bodhicitta as well? Are we manifesting as bodhisattvas? Okay, verse 180. So what is to be realized in Mahayana is these 16 kinds of emptiness. So there's the long list here, which we're going to go through in the following verses, so I won't read them. And they're later divided into 4. They're regrouped in verses 219 to 222. And taken together, these 16 and these 4 fully teach the selflessness of phenomena, the emptiness of phenomena. Right? So this is all those aspects for which the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas may not have the interest, the merit, or the teacher. So 181, 182, we start with emptiness of inner. And this refers to the senses and the sense consciousnesses. So verse 181, for example, is the eye and the other 5 senses. 182 is the eye consciousness and the others of the 6 consciousnesses. And I think it's worth just taking a moment to remind ourselves of the Abhidhamma here. The way these work is the eye consciousness, to take one example, it arises dependently based on the internal sense organ, right, so the eye, and the external sense object, in this case the form. And when they meet, this is contact, which is one of the 12 links of dependence origination, and then that in turn generates feelings and so on. So in fact, actually, if you look at the 12 links, so number 3 is consciousness, vijnana, so that's the sort of raw awareness or subjectivity. Number 4 is nama rupa, which is name and form. And that refers to the psychological and physical aspects of the person. Number 5 is salayatana, the 6 sense bases. So this is the sense organs and their objects. Number 6 is phassa, which is contact, we just talked about, which is the meeting of the subjective consciousness, the sense object and the sense organ. That leads to number 7, vedana, feelings or sensation, so pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And then number 8 onwards you get clinging, and then the rest of samsara is generated. Okay, so this refers back then to the classic teachings on the 12 links. And when we say there's the 6 senses and 6 sense consciousnesses, so the first is eye consciousness and form, second is ear and sound, third is nose and smell, fourth is tongue and taste, fifth is body and tactile sensation, sixth is mind and intellectual sensation, which refers to thoughts or ideation. It's also worth noting that the Madhyamaka is different from the Chittamatra, because in the Madhyamaka there are only 6 consciousnesses, as we've just described, and self-awareness wisdom is included in the 6th, whereas for the Chittamatra and Zen, there are 8 consciousnesses, and we'll come to these actually in the Heart Sutra, because number 7 is called the Manas Vijnana, translated there as the Dhatu of Dharmas. That's deluded awareness that discriminates and judges. But on one hand, it localizes experience through thinking, and on the other hand, it universalizes experience through intuitive perception of alaya vijnana. And then finally, number 8, which we saw last week, the alaya vijnana, right? The mind consciousness dhatu, or the storehouse consciousness, which is the base of the other 7. So this verse is the only other one in this section that has much commentary by Mipam. And he asks, well, what do we mean when we say, as the verse says, the I is empty of I? And this is actually quite important because some of the Tibetan schools talk about emptiness in slightly different ways. And Chandrakirti, in his auto-commentary, his self-commentary, says, the expression the I is empty of I, and so on for the other phenomena, expresses the nature of emptiness. Emptiness does not mean the absence of something from something else, as when one says the I is devoid of an inner agent, or of the duality of the subject and object of perception. And so here Mipam says, let's contrast this with people who say things like, the I isn't empty of I, it's empty of true existence. Mipam says, what could this mean? I mean, it could only refer to a truly existing I or a truly existing non-I. Nobody's going to confuse the I with a truly existing non-I. So if there's another truly existing I and a not truly existing I together, and we try and remove the not truly existing one, well, then we're left with what our opponents may claim is a mere appearance, but by definition, that must then be truly existing, which is a real problem. Mipam says, if we burn a chariot, everything disappears, including its appearance. So if we remove the truly existing I, we should also remove its appearance. Our opponents then object, well, if the I doesn't truly exist, it couldn't appear. But we've already dealt with this objection, right, in verses 107 to 113. It was in week 4, just before we had dependent arising in 114. So, in responding to this, Mipam ends on I would say, rather dismissive note. He says, the I's emptiness of itself does not at all invalidate the I's appearance. Indeed, the Madhyamaka asserts that phenomena, despite being empty, nevertheless appear. The proponents of this other utterly foolish theory are passionately attached to words but not their meaning. The idea is something at which the learned merely smile, rejecting it at first glance, as indeed they should. Okay, so 183 to 184, first 2 lines, emptiness of outer. So now this refers to form and the outer aggregates, or what we talked about previously is these sense objects. So the skandhas, just to review, the 5 skandhas are form, which is rupa, so matter, body, material form. Sensation, vedana, which is sensory experience, right, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Bear in mind, that's not the same as feelings in the sense of emotions, right? So when we use the word feeling, it refers to the sensations, bodily sensations. It doesn't refer to emotions. Right, the third is perception, samjña. So sensory or mental process that registers, recognizes, labels, right? So things like the shape of a tree, the color green, the emotion of fear, all those are perceptions, labels, right? Imputed phenomena. Number 4 is mental formations or samskara. That's any mental imprints or habits or conditioning that's triggered by an object, any process that makes a person initiate action. Right, so when we talked about operant conditioning last week in behaviorism, it's that kind of idea, right? The habitual patterns that can be triggered by a stimulus, by an object. And finally, number 5 is consciousness, the vijnana, and that's the 6 types corresponding to the 6 senses. Although, as we said, if you're Chittamatra, there are 8. And so in the Heart Sutra, there's the line that corresponds to these verses is, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no appearance, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no dharmas, no I dhatu up to no mind dhatu, no dhatu of dharmas, no mind consciousness dhatu. Okay, so that's basically listing everything we just talked about, right? So the first, no form, no feeling, no perception, and so forth, that's the 5 aggregates. Right? Then no eye, no ear, no nose, etc. It's the 6 senses. Then no appearance, no sound, no smell, and so forth. That's the 6 sense objects. The no I dhatu up to no mind dhatu is the 6 consciousnesses. The no dhatu of dharmas is the 7th, and the no mind consciousness dhatu is the 8th, right? The alaya. So yeah, what we're doing here, you'll see, right? These verses, they are very much connecting us to the Heart Sutra already. Right. So 184, the last 2 lines. Emptiness of outer and inner. That's the 3rd of the 16 emptinesses. So in the commentary, Rinpoche says it refers to someone else's 18 dhatus. Though Mipam has an alternative commentary, he says it refers to the 5 inner supports, right, the kokpa, of the 5 sense organs, which are included within consciousness, but not included within the senses. So therefore, they're both outside and inside. And these are actually material supports of the senses, right? Not to be confused with the senses themselves. And according to the Abhidhamma, they're actual physical objects. They have different shapes and are located in the eyes, ears, tongue, and so forth. Right? In Sanskrit, the pasada rupas. So, for example, the eye sense is supposedly very small, no bigger in size than the head of a louse. The ear sense is in the interior of the ear, at a spot shaped like a finger ring and fringed by tender, tawny hairs. So there's all these descriptions of the Abhidhamma where these supposed pasada rupas actually exist in the body. All right, now number 4, verses 185 to 186. Very important. The emptiness of emptiness. And this was taught to overcome the notion that emptiness truly exists. Right? Because some unskillful students might read the Madhyamaka and conclude, aha, Chandrakirti has established the view of emptiness, right? That must be my view. But actually, it's not like that at all. So I thought it might be helpful just to approach this with a couple of readings using slightly different language. I thought it might give us a different access. So I wanted to quote from Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, a couple of quotes. Firstly, from The Myth of Freedom, section on the Eightfold Path, pages 93 and 94. So Rinpoche says, the first point the Buddha made has to do with right view. Wrong view is a matter of conceptualization. Someone is walking toward us. Suddenly we freeze. Not only do we freeze ourselves, but we also freeze the space in which the person is walking towards us. We call him a friend who is walking through the space, or enemy. Thus, the person is automatically walking through a frozen situation of fixed ideas. This is that, or this is not that. This is what Buddha called a wrong view. It is a conceptualized view that is imperfect, because we do not see the situation as it is. There is the possibility, on the other hand, of not freezing that space. The person could walk into a lubricated situation of myself and that person as we are. Such a lubricated situation can exist and can create open space. Of course, openness could be appropriated as a philosophical concept as well, but the philosophy need not necessarily be fixed. The situation could be seen without the idea of lubrication as such, without any fixed idea. In other words, the philosophical attitude could be just to see the situation as it is. That person working toward me is not a friend, therefore he's not an enemy either. He is just a person approaching me. I don't have to prejudge him at all. That is what is called right view. And there's another lovely quote from Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. So this section's from Shunyata, page 195. So Trungpa Rinpoche says, Nagarjuna's conclusions are summed up in the principle of non-dwelling, the main principle of the Madhyamaka school. He said that any philosophical view could be refuted, that one must not dwell upon any answer or description of reality, whether extreme or moderate, including the notion of one mind. Even to say that non-dwelling is the answer is delusory, for one must not dwell upon non-dwelling. Nagarjuna's way was one of non-philosophy, which was not simply another philosophy at all. He said the wise should not dwell in the middle either. So it's a very beautiful statement of the emptiness of emptiness. And we'll come back to this when we talk about the Heart Sutra. Okay, 187 to 188, emptiness of vastness. Pretty straightforward, and here Mipam explains this was set out in order to counter the Vaibhashika belief in a permanent and truly existing space or infinite immensity. 189 to 190, that's the sixth kind of emptiness. Emptiness of the ultimate. So Dharmakaya is this emptiness of the ultimate. By the way, several commentaries on the 10 bulls say that the 8th bull that we've saw today, that actually represents Dharmakaya. So why did Buddha teach this? To dispel the Shravaka wrong view that cessation, or nirvana, is a truly existing phenomenon. But again, we have to be careful, right? Because as soon as our idea of the ultimate, whether it's enlightenment or the three kayas or anything like that, becomes truly existing, we fall into the same trap. Which I said, many of us think nirvana truly exists, which is why we go to Dharma centers, why we practice, but we end up clinging to the idea of nirvana. We have big expectations and then endless disappointment and guilt. So I think that's a lovely practice advice. Just notice for yourself, if you're starting to relate to your own practice that way, maybe you've started to develop some kind of clinging to nirvana or to enlightenment. 191, seventh, emptiness of compounded. So we know that the Shravakayana accepts that all compounded phenomena are impermanent, but here we want to emphasize they are also emptiness. Because if we don't emphasize that, we may end up with some truly existing substantial base, right? Like the point-like atoms that we talked about last week. So to establish the emptiness of phenomena, we need to show that all phenomena, right, the whole of the three worlds, are all emptiness. Number 8, which is verse 192, emptiness of the uncompounded. So some Shravakas believe nirvana or cessation is uncompounded, similar to what we said before. He also said, seeing things like luminosity, awareness, clear light mind, anytime we convert any of these things into a phenomenon, we end up developing a subtle clinging. Right? So just notice one's own relationship to these supposedly holy and precious, exotic aspects of the path. 193. Emptiness of the limitless, or what is beyond extremes. And this is taught to counter clinging to the Madhyamaka path. 194, 195. It's the 10th. It's emptiness of that which is beginningless and endless, in other words, samsara. So taught to dispel clinging to samsara as truly existing. And actually, the commentary here might be helpful for some of the debates that are ongoing about rebirth. He said, samsara is said to be without a beginning or an end. It is also without duration. In samsara, there is no real going from one life to a later life, and no coming from an earlier life to the present life. All is but a dreamlike appearance. All right, 196 and 197. So this is the emptiness. In the text it says non-discarding, but I prefer the Padmakara translation, the emptiness of what should not be rejected. And here we're referring to the distinctions we have between virtue and non-virtue on the path, because we're trying to eliminate our attachment to virtue. Right, Rinpoche has talked a lot about bad Buddhists, right? The idea we can become holier than thou, and that becomes a big, big obstacle for our path. Right? And in this case, when we talk about rejecting the non-virtuous and holding on to the virtuous, we actually are referring to the Mahayana path itself. Right? And as we've seen before, any idea of virtue and non-virtue is itself empty. And so when we talk about purifying what's non-virtuous, actually the ultimate purification is realizing there is nothing to purify in the first place. So normally in the dualistic path, we would confess when we are wrong, done something bad or unethical. But in a non-dual path, we confess when we're dualistic. So this is perhaps not the time, but I want to just quote a little bit from a lovely practice called the Narak Kongshak, which is a Vajrayana confession practice. And if you know this, if you're a Vajrayana practitioner, the section on confession in the expanse of the view is quite wonderful, right? And really great to read now that we've been studying Madhyamaka a little. And for those of you who don't know this, I felt maybe this would establish some kind of auspicious connection to the world of non-dual practices. So I'll read a couple verses. Dhammadhatu itself is simplicity. Seeing it as the duality of existence and non-existence, how exhausting. Clinging to things and their qualities, how depressing. We confess this in the expanse of simplicity, great bliss. As Samantabhadra is free from being good or bad, seeing him as clean or unclean, how exhausting. Clinging to the duality of good and bad, how depressing. We confess this in the expanse of Samantabhadra, great bliss. Equanimity is free from being large or small. Seeing it as oneself and others, how exhausting. Clinging to the duality of large and small, how depressing. We confess this in the expanse of equanimity, great bliss. Bodhicitta is free from birth or death. Seeing it as this and future lives, how exhausting. Clinging to the duality of birth and death, how depressing. We confess this in the expanse of unchanging deathlessness. So again, if you know this practice, again, I really encourage this, something you could practice for the remaining weeks of this program. Right, number 12, the emptiness of true nature. So that's 198 to 199. And here the point is that the Buddha didn't make up or invent the ultimate essence or nature of phenomena. He just pointed out what was there. Now, the challenge is that our opponent may say, well, if it was there already, it's uncontrived, so maybe we should admit it's truly existing. Right? So we need to combat belief in the truly existing emptiness of emptiness, or the potential clinging to the nature of phenomena, the nature of mind, which is uncontrived. And that's why this is taught. And again, very important advice for Vajrayana practitioners who might develop attachment to the nature of mind. Because then, your path is no better than the Chittamatra path that believes in truly existing mind, or even a Hindu path that believes in truly existing Atman. Right, number 13, 200 to first two lines of 201, the emptiness of all phenomena. And again, just repeating the 18 dhatus that we talked about previously, but they're grouped in a slightly different way here. And number 14, the emptiness of characteristics. It's quite a long section. It's 14 and a half verses from the last two lines of 201 to 215. Basically, it's talking about all the aspects of ground, path, and fruit, and showing they are all emptiness. Right, so 202 to 204 is the emptiness of ground, right? Things like the 5 aggregates. 205 to 209 is the emptiness of path. Things like 6 parameters, 4 samadhis, the 37 limbs of enlightenment. All of them are emptiness also. 210 to 215 is the emptiness of fruit. For example, the 10 strengths, the 4 fearlessnesses, and the other qualities of the Buddha, his great compassion, his omniscient wisdom. All of these are also empty. Right, so we know this already, right, from Nagarjuna's Mula-Madhyamika Karika. We know this, as we said, from the Diamond Sutra, but we're reaffirming everything on the path, the entirety of the ground, all of our practices, bodhicitta, and even up to enlightenment and all the qualities of enlightenment. None of these truly exist. That's a profound message. 216, 217, this is the emptiness of what's here called the non-apprehended. Padmakara translates as the unobservable, which I like. And this refers to the 3 times, which cannot be found or pointed out. And the fact that they cannot be found is their unobservability. And this unobservability is also emptiness. 218. That's emptiness of nature without substantial existence. Padmakara calls emptiness of non-things. And here we're referring to dependently arisen phenomena because they arise from causal conditions, so they don't truly exist. But we want to make sure we include them as well. They also are emptiness. 219 to 223 is a condensed classification. Here, the Padmakara translation has things, non-things, the nature itself, and instead of what we have here as the emptiness of other nature, they say the emptiness of the transcendent quality. Right? Whether or not the Buddhas appear, the nature of phenomena is emptiness, and that is their transcendent quality. And that also is emptiness. Right, so 223, the last 2 lines. A conclusion and a scriptural source, right? Just to emphasize that all of these 20 are taught in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And this is, again, going to link us to the Heart Sutra. Now, the Prajnaparamita Sutra is very interesting because there are actually many, many versions, right? The longest one has 100,000 lines. Then you've got versions with 25,000, 18,000, 8,000, 2,500, 700, 500, and 300. In fact, the 300-line one is called the Trishatika Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is also the Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita Sutra, right? What we know as the Diamond Sutra. So that's actually one of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And then, of course, the smallest, the shortest, is the Heart Sutra, the Prajnaparamita Hridaya. Now, out of those ones just mentioned, contemporary scholarship assesses that the oldest is the 8,000-line sutra, which was approximately dates to the 1st century before the Common Era. The Heart Sutra itself is much later. The date is uncertain, but the best estimates of contemporary scholars is something like the 4th to the 6th centuries. So that's 700 years later than the 8,000-line. And it's very short, right? The Chinese version, attributed to Xuanzang, has only 260 Chinese characters. And the Heart Sutra is said to contain the entire meaning of the longer ones. Wikipedia notes something interesting, actually, that the text of the Heart Sutra is largely a quotation from one of the longer versions, right, from the 25,000-line sutra, and appears to have been composed in Chinese from a translation by Kumarajiva and then later translated back into Sanskrit. And it was probably not intended as a sutra, but as a dharani, right? And as you may know, a dharani is like a long mantra. They were often chanted to protect oneself from malign influences, from calamities, and so on. And I think actually it's quite apt that it was considered a dharani for chanting, because now really the Heart Sutra is very frequently chanted throughout China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and then later, when it was translated back into Tibetan, throughout Tibetan Buddhism as well. So, and we'll come to that in a minute. All right, so that is the conclusion of the argument, and the last three verses are just a summary of the qualities. So 224, he realizes the ultimate truth and sees it as clearly as the Kurura fruit. Now, this is a fruit which in Sanskrit is called the Amalaka or Amla. It's a transparent fruit, and if you hold it in your hand, you can see the lines of your hand through the fruit. Right, so that's meant to indicate that the way that the Bodhisattva could completely see through phenomena, see their empty nature. And so, although on the ultimate level there is nothing to enter and no one who enters, in conventional truth, the sixth Bhumi Bodhisattva enters into cessation. And actually, this fruit, this Amalaka, it is a real fruit. It's the fruit of a tree called the Emblic mirobalan, Philanthus emblica. But it's very interesting. It has quite a history in India because it was considered a sacred tree by the Hindus because the god Vishnu is believed to dwell in it. And actually it has its own holy day called Amalaka Ekadashi. Hindus also believe that Amla is said to have originated from drops of Amrit that spilled onto earth accidentally when the gods and demons were fighting after Kshera Sagar Manthan. And actually this view claims that because it's drops of Amrit, it cures every disease and extends life. In fact, the Amrit spilled supposedly onto 4 places, and the Kumbh Mela, if you've ever been to that, is celebrated at these 4 places every 12 years for this reason. Right? People believe that after bathing there during the Kumbh Mela, you can attain moksha. And even in the Sanskrit Buddhist tradition, half of one of these Amalaka fruits was the final gift given to the Buddhist Sangha by the great Indian Emperor Ashoka. Also, I think it's quite appropriate then that he's chosen it as the example here, not just because of its transparency, because it has all this kind of resonance in the tradition. All right, 225. They realize conventional truth, right? So although the minds of the sixth Bhumi Bodhisattva rest in cessation, that does not mean they turn away from sentient beings. Indeed, their relative qualities shine forth ever more strongly. And even for ourselves in ordinary life, we know that, right? When we're less caught in our own dualism, our own reactivity, we are better able to be there for others, right? We're more able to make wise and compassionate decisions. Right, and finally then, as we enter the end of the seventh Bhumi, the Bodhisattva outshines the Shravaka Arhats Pratyeka Buddhas. And then finally, 226, the qualities united. The sixth Bhumi Bodhisattva is like the king of swans. And on the broad wings of the 2 truths, right, which correspond to the profound view and the vast activities of conventional truth, they soar ahead of lesser birds, by that meaning ordinary beings, but even the Shravakas Pratyeka Buddhas, and fly to the far shore. So I think this translation is lovely. I also want to offer you the Padmakara one. And like the king of swans, ahead of lesser birds they soar. On broad white wings of relative and ultimate full spread, and on the strength of virtue's mighty wind they fly, to gain the far and supreme shore, the oceanic qualities of victory. Okay, so with that we've finished the 6th chapter, and we'll now turn to the Heart Sutra. So, just a few points of summary. Chapter 6, as we just discovered, the whole chapter is based on the Prajnaparamita Sutra, right? Which, the shortest version, is the Heart Sutra. Number 2, we've already said what makes the Mahayana path greater, and indeed, as Mipam says, the only sole final path, is that we need to establish a focus on the emptiness of phenomena, not just the emptiness of the person. In particular, we saw these 16 or 20 different kinds of emptiness, which articulated the various phenomena that are empty, including form and all aggregates, 183, emptiness itself, 185, 186. And so, the emptiness of emptiness in the Heart Sutra, we hear emptiness is form. Right? It's a beautiful expression of that. And also very important, we don't want to put nirvana above samsara. Right? As soon as we do that, we're introducing some kind of dualism, some kind of preference, and then it becomes an extreme view. Finally, as you've seen, the King of Swans flies on his broad wings of the two truths of profound view and vast activities. Okay, so I'm going to extract a few elements from Rinpoche's teaching on the Heart Sutra in Kathmandu, April, May this year. So Rinpoche mentioned, there's a lovely quote from the Majjhima Nikaya 26, the Arya Pariyasana Sutta, the Noble Search. What the Buddha said after his enlightenment, he said, "This Dhamma that I have attained is deep, hard to see, hard to realize, peaceful, refined, beyond the scope of conjecture, subtle, to be experienced by the wise." Then, after thinking a little about ordinary sentient beings, he said, "What is abstruse, subtle, deep, hard to see, going against the flow, those delighting in passion, cloaked in the mass of darkness, won't see." So Rinpoche said, his version was Buddha saying, "I found a truth that's profound, brilliant, deep, vast, infinite, but nobody's going to be able to understand it, so I'll keep quiet in the forest." Now, we ordinarily hear this as the Buddha implying he doesn't want to teach, and then the legend goes, the gods Brahma and Indra came, "Please teach," they said. They gave him a conch, and so on and so forth. He taught the Four Noble Truths. But actually, as Rinpoche said, from another angle, the fact that he's saying, nobody can hear this teaching, so I can't teach it, it's not so much that he doesn't want to, is that he's saying emptiness, what he has realized, right, the prajnaparamita, it is beyond words, right? He cannot teach it. It's not that he doesn't want to, is that he can't. Right, as Rinpoche said, it's a very beautiful sutta because it includes the idea right from the beginning that he won't be able to teach that which is non-dual, right, because it is beyond words and beyond concepts. So this brings us to the question of, as Shariputra asked Avalokiteshvara, he said, how will we practice the profound prajnaparamita? And this is our challenge, right? As we said earlier, we know intellectually that everything is emptiness, but we don't know what to do. Right? Initially, we're very excited by this possibility that we can change our narratives, that we can reinterpret, reinvent ourselves as a bodhisattva or even as a deity. But then it all comes crashing down. Right? If everything is emptiness, how should we act in the world? How do we know what's good and what's bad? Because we've dissolved all ideas of good and bad. Right? We've maybe established our idea, a new idea of the self. We've taken refuge, we've taken our bodhisattva vow. We visualize ourselves as deities. But again, why are we doing this? What is the point if it's all empty? And so then, as we saw in the hero's journey, we enter this dark night of the soul, right? We're lost. Our destination is unknown. By the way, this phrase, the dark night, I know it implies something negative. Actually, in the original poem, it was a poem by Saint John of the Cross. And the original poem is called La Noche Oscura del Alma, which is the journey of the soul to the mystical union with God. And it's called the dark night because darkness represents that the destination, right, God, is unknowable, just like the classic mystical text, the cloud of unknowing, right? So something very similar is happening here, right? Once we've dissolved all rationality, all stories, we get to what we've repeated several times from Jimmy Lingpa, right? As soon as we talk, it is all contradiction. As soon as we think, it is all confusion. And so our Dharma story is just another story, right? We saw just now, the end of chapter 6, we've refuted the ground, the path, and the fruit. We've shown that all of them are just emptiness, right? None of them truly exist. So we really have to confront this danger of nihilism, right? We have to find a way of working with this emptiness, this prajnaparamita. It's a big problem, and many of you, as we said earlier, are experiencing this. And so that brings us then to the Heart Sutra, because Shariputra, he's asking the same question that all of us are asking, right? How should a son or daughter of noble family train who wishes to practice the profound prajnaparamita? Right? He's facing the same problem. He likewise has dissolved all of his concepts. He doesn't know how to practice. He doesn't know, right? Because we've just discovered there are no bearings anymore. Um, and it's an interesting question because he's not asking, you know, how should I meditate? How should I dwell on emptiness? He's asking, how should I practice? As Rinpoche said, how should I live by, act according to Prajnaparamita? Right? He's not just looking at meditation. He's looking at, meditation and post-meditation. And Rinpoche talks a lot in that teaching about, one of the challenges is there is no answer in Buddhism about how one should act. Right? We have everything from monks that shave their head and take that extremely seriously, to sadhus who grow their hair long and take that seriously. And they're both Buddhists, right? And we cannot say one is right and one is wrong. Right? So we don't have action. We don't have clear guidance on how that should look. Right? The only way to know is through the view. And I think the other problem many of us face is that our meditation and our post-meditation have become very separated, right? We may do one thing when we're on our cushion, but then actually bringing emptiness into our lives, we don't know what to do. It's a little bit like the bodhisattvas on the bhumis, right? As we've already said, when they're during their meditation time, we cannot distinguish them, but during their post-meditation time, they're very different, right? So what they're actually doing on the bhumis is successively finding a way to make that post-meditation more like their meditation, until finally, upon the stage of the Buddha, there is no separation, right? There is no distinction anymore between meditation and post-meditation. So, what can we do, right? I mean, if we're facing this kind of question, actually, for me, I mean, some of you asked me if I could say something about my own journey through these teachings. And I know for years I would ask Rinpoche, because I think I got stuck on this very same place, right? This idea of, if indeed everything is emptiness, how can one act in the world? There's no preferred way of living. There's no preferred thing one should do with one's life. I think I wanted some kind of uh, almost like an ultimate purpose. I think I wanted some validation that I was doing something worthy or good, that I was a good bodhisattva. I don't know what really. But if you look at self-help, positive psychology nowadays, so much of it is about discovering and then following your passion, your life purpose, as if it's somehow lying buried under the ground for you to discover. And there's no antidote to this question, right? Except to keep practicing. And we just have to work through it, right? Dissolve all of our imputations. Because all of these questions, as we've seen before, these are just imputations, all these doubts, all these concerns. And over the years, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen Rinpoche get questions like this, and he's basically always answered, just keep doing your practice. And actually, even here in the text, and it was earlier, a few weeks back, on 166, his advice was, ultimately, we should refute all views. Relatively, we should accept everything without analysis. And conventionally, do your practice. Right, so with that in mind, I'd actually like to just take a moment to actually do some practice. So I'm just going to do a brief meditation, very much building on what Rinpoche taught in Kathmandu. So if you happen to be listening to the audio while driving, please be careful. So wherever you are, watching or listening to this, just take a moment, get a sense of your environment, and then find something in front of you to look at, whatever, and just be aware of that. And actually, if you can, be aware that you're doing that. Okay, did you do it? As Rinpoche said, this has got nothing to do with sitting straight. He said, look, it's so disheartening when people think that's what practice is about. It's a poverty mentality. No, do what you want. Scratch, yawn, cough, get confused if you want. The question was, were you aware of what you were doing as you were doing it? And he said, because if you have, you should trust it. Right? Yes, it's short, but you have actually done it. Right? You were aware of what was happening right now in the present moment. Right? It wasn't some later memory, like some of the Mahayana mindfulness practices. So just knowing what is happening. Because if you did that, you should consider it was a good meditation. Don't worry about having to do it 24 hours at a go. And why is it important? Because in that moment, you were not distracted. Okay, we're going to come back to this. So back to the text. So after Shariputra asked his question, then Avalokiteshvara replied, and here's the text. Addressed in this way, noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said to Venerable Shariputra, O Shariputra, a son or daughter of noble family who wishes to practice the profound Prajnaparamita should see in this way, seeing the 5 skandhas to be empty of nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness also is form. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is no other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are emptiness. Thus, Shariputra, all dharmas are emptiness. As Rinpoche said, it's interesting, he chose to speak first of the 5 aggregates, not about mathematics or political science or ethics or philosophy. He talked about the 5 aggregates because, as we saw last week, that is the base that we incorrectly take as the idea for self. And then self-cherishing, self-clinging, all the rest, right? So if we can start by understanding the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, just as we did earlier in the previous weeks, then we can refute the self. And as Rinpoche said, just these few lines, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Just those 2 lines, we got 2 very different traditions of Buddhism, right? The form is emptiness, we get Nagarjuna and his company, or the whole emptiness tradition. The emptiness is form, that's Asanga, right? The Buddha nature tradition. Also, of course, influenced a lot of Chinese, Japanese, East Asian Buddhists. And, very complementary, really just focusing on different aspects of the same thing. And Rinpoche said, actually, when he taught the Uttara Tantra teachings on Buddha nature, he just said, if Madhyamaka is studying more about the emptiness aspect, then the Uttara Tantra is studying the emptiness is form aspect. Now, I think there's something really important here that I must say I've experienced people tend to miss a lot of the time, which is we tend to just repeat the first part of that. We say form is emptiness, emptiness is form, right? We focus on the form aggregate. But actually, as we just said, it's all of the aggregates, right? We could equally say feeling is emptiness, emptiness is feeling. Consciousness is emptiness, emptiness is consciousness. But I noticed that actually, again, if we look on some of the debates that are happening online right now on the forum, etc., we're not talking about these other aggregates. I think this is a big habit we need to fix. But I think it's also that we end up talking about form as an object rather than as a subject. I'll talk about this in a second. But I think the very same is true in Western mindfulness, right? We tend to focus almost exclusively on the form and the sensation aggregates. The other aggregates, even though they're part of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? The other things that we would want to be mindful of, most of the time that's not taught in the West. So in particular, when we say, if we think about the consciousness aggregate, right, the 5th, we say form is emptiness, well, right, consciousness is emptiness, right? Emptiness is consciousness, right? So then we can talk about the pairings of emptiness and Buddha nature, emptiness and clarity, emptiness and luminosity, emptiness and spontaneous presence, right? So once you start understanding these, you'll very quickly see that form then doesn't only refer to an object, but it refers to things that we might more normally consider subject, right? Like consciousness. And of course, since this is a Madhyamaka teaching, you should be thinking of subject and object as non-dual. We'll come back to this in a minute. But the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of the time we're using this non-dual language. It's supposed to be taking us to a place of non-duality, but we're just using it very dualistically, right? We talk about the emptiness of tree. We say tree is emptiness. But we're talking just about the object, right? Very dualistic. Similarly, right, Western mindfulness comes out of the Burmese tradition, but very dualistic, right? It's mindfulness of the body, of the breath, of walking, of sensation. You see these as object. Right? There's no focus on the subject. Right? So it's all part of the form is emptiness. We don't have the emptiness is form going on. Right? And really important part of that is the sense of self-awareness, the subjectivity. So sort of relate this back to this idea of, back to practice. I mean, again, one thing many years ago I asked Rinpoche, I said, look, if everything is equally empty, then why do we need to use the Buddha as the basis for our practice? Why can't we pray to a tree? Right? Surely that's just as good if everything is emptiness. And Rinpoche said, well, yes, of course. Ultimately, there is no difference. They're all equally good in the ultimate. But the difference is, conventionally, there's much more of a tradition, a support, much more merit around following the Dharma in its way it's currently taught. Right? There's teachings, there's teachers, there's monasteries, there's Sangha, there's stupas, there's lots to inspire you. Right? If you're going to start your own Dharma based on worshipping trees, yeah, you could do it, but you'd have to rebuild that entire infrastructure, right? And so all the conventional parts of the path you would not have. And it's worth reflecting that somebody who really understands the view, they can see anything as a Dharma teaching, right? Anything can inspire them. And not in the Western sense, because sometimes I think we say, look, I can be inspired by a beautiful tree or a vast landscape or a beautiful sunset or amazing art or music. And yes, that touches us emotionally, but that doesn't mean there's any non-duality there, right? It doesn't mean it's inspiring us to see it as Dharma. And you may recall in week 3, we talked about the story of Patrul Rinpoche introducing the nature of mind to Nichiren Longtok outside Dzogchen Monastery. And, very famous lines, he said, do you see the stars up in the sky? Right? And Nichiren Longtok got it in that moment. Introduced the nature of mind. Rinpoche said, how many young lovers have said those same words to each other? Yes, do you see the stars, my love? And it has only become a source of greater attachment and delusion. So this again is where we need merit, right? What is the distinction between Nichiren Longtok being able to understand that and accomplish realization and a young couple? The same words, right? Do you see the stars? But for them, it just leads them to more delusion. Right? And also what we talked about in previous weeks, right? Rinpoche's stories of the 3 kinds of listener. Yeah? How is it that some of us can hear a teaching the first time, others of us it takes a long time, and the third kind of person will never hear it until we have a change in our life circumstances. We need something to happen, right? And another way of talking about this, and Rinpoche also talked about this in Kathmandu, is the notion of a disciple of superior faculties. And what does this mean? And again, very interesting because it comes back to non-duality, right? One of the most important qualities in Tibetan, they call it michiwi chepa, which means someone who can accommodate anything, right? Things like shunyata, mahasandhi, dzogchen, right? They look for students where, again, the Tibetan term is Zempa Guyampo, meaning very vast and open-minded, right? So if somebody says Kathmandu is completely upside down, hanging in the air, they might say, well, why not? And Rinpoche said, and yet it does not mean they are gullible or an idiot, right? As he said, there's a very thin line. So as he's taught many times, this difference between irrational, rational, and beyond rational, right? Irrational is the idiot believing in fairy tales, believing just what our cultures, our academia, our upbringing, our politicians tell us. Rational, well, we know what that is, right? We understand the causal path. We realize, because we've studied Madhyamaka, that all of these stories of self, these ideas of self, are without base, right? So we can rewrite them. We can redefine ourselves as a Buddhist, a Bodhisattva, a deity. But the truly superior faculty, right, open-minded, completely beyond rational, they can accommodate a new story with great ease, right? Many of you were talking to me this week saying, wow, it's such a struggle. Sure, in principle, I know I can change my story, but in practice, it's hard. There's so much habit. And yes, that's true. As we said last week, it is all habit, right? And that's what it comes down to, right? This idea of merit, this idea of being a disciple of superior faculties, it's all a question of, have you accomplished that merit? Have you accumulated it? Now, I know it's frustrating. Some of us wish we could understand this more quickly. But as we said before, there is only one answer. You need more merit, so you have to practice. That's all there is to do. All right, back to this idea of saying, look, the non-existence of form, right? As Mipam said, that's a non-affirming negation. It's the Shravaka way. It's just refuting one extreme, the first extreme, the extreme of existence. And we are trying to refute all four extremes, right? Existence, non-existence, both and neither. So back to Patrul Rinpoche and Nyingma Longtok. He wasn't asking Nyingma Longtok to look at the stars and see them as empty, right? I mean, we could understand it that way. And yes, I mean, of course, it's better to see the stars as empty than not, right? We could say, oh yeah, they're not truly existing stars. They're just, conventional phenomena. But that's still a very basic dualistic way of thinking. Right? That kind of emptiness does not bring us non-dual awareness. And for most of us, it's just a kind of dry, kind of academic chanting of the Heart Sutra. We're just going to go, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. We haven't realized anything, right? I mean, a scientist can tell you the stars are empty. He knows nothing about non-duality. So what's the difference? Well, it's like Rinpoche was saying when he invited us to know what was happening while it was happening in that meditation. Right, Patrul Rinpoche, when he asked Nyingma Longtok, he said, can you see the stars? He wasn't just asking him, was he able to see the emptiness of the object? He was asking him, in that moment, could he see that he was seeing the stars, right? Was he aware of his own mind, his own awareness at the same time, the same moment as the stars, right? Because that idea of the simultaneous awareness of the subject and the object, now that is non-duality, right? Now, I mean, the word see probably isn't the right word because you can't see yourself and see the stars, right? Seeing is dualistic. So as Jigme Lingpa says, right, our words, our concepts, they collapse. But anyone who's experienced this, they will know, right? And so when Roche was saying mindfulness, this idea of being aware that you're doing it, that's what he means, right? So whatever it is you're paying attention to, whatever it is you're looking at, yes, be aware of the object, but also be aware of yourself. Know that you're seeing the object. Okay, so let's do it again. Right, find an object in front of you. Just be aware. And again, if you can, be aware that you're looking at it while you're looking at it. Okay. Did you see it? Is that different from the first time? Well, if you were able to see the difference, that is the difference between dualistic practice and non-dual practice, right? That is what it means to practice the Madhyamaka, to practice the Heart Sutra. Yeah? Just again, dualism is seeing the object, right? All our concepts, our words, talking about the object as empty, tree is empty, empty is tree, no reference to our subject, right? We're still totally trapped in dualism. But non-duality, the object and the subject, we are aware of both together. And if you've experienced it just now, you'll know what I mean. And likewise, right, we talked earlier about our ideas of self being baseless. So similarly, yeah, we could see our idea of self purely as an object, as a phenomenon. Fine, yes, we get stuck in stories of family, culture, tribe, gender, identity, whatever they may be. If those are empty, sure, we can write a new story, a Dharma story, a story of us being on the path. I'm a bodhisattva, I'm a deity. But all of this is still telling a story about us as an object, right? They're still very dualistic. You've changed your story within a dualistic frame. Yeah? The storyteller has not yet been brought into the picture. So, what about the possibility of non-dual storytelling, right? When you know you're telling the story as you tell the story, right? Can you get the object creating the self-narrative at the same time as the subject is there? If you do this, you'll find the story becomes completely empty and fluid and dissolves. Right? In the teachings, it's sometimes said to be like a snake uncoiling itself. This is non-dual practice. So back to the Heart Sutra, right? And this is what it means to actually practice the Prajnaparamita. Then what you'll see is that none of your stories is real. Right? You'll just see it. You'll actually realize it. So in other words, as the sutra says, no ignorance, no end of ignorance up to no old age and death, no end of old age and death, no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. And so, therefore, Shariputra, since the Bodhisattvas have no attainment, they abide by means of Prajnaparamita. Since there is no obscuration of mind, there is no fear. They transcend falsity and attain complete nirvana. All the Buddhas of the three times, by means of Prajnaparamita, fully awaken to unsurpassable, true, complete enlightenment. I suppose I should ask you, were you aware that you were listening just now? If so, very good. Okay, so I'd like to close this week a little earlier than usual. With some more from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, again from Myth of Freedom, pages 13 to 15 from the section on egolessness, where he's talking about going beyond an intellectual understanding of emptiness. He says, there are two stages to understanding egolessness. In the first stage, we perceive the ego does not exist as a solid entity, that it is impermanent, constantly changing, that it was our concepts that made it seem solid. So we conclude that ego does not exist. But we still have formulated a subtle concept of egolessness. There is still a watcher of the egolessness, a watcher to identify with it and maintain its existence. The second stage is seeing through the subtle concept and dropping the watcher. So true egolessness is the absence of the concept of egolessness. In the first stage, there's a sense of someone perceiving egolessness. In the second, even the perceiver does not exist. In the first, we perceive that there is no fixed identity because everything is relative to something else. In the second stage, there is the understanding that the notion of relativity needs a watcher to perceive it, to confirm it, which introduces another relative notion, the watcher and the watched. A little later he continues, a true understanding of egolessness cuts through opinion. The absence of a notion of egolessness allows us to fully experience pain, birth, and death, because then there are no philosophical paddings. I think this is beautiful. The whole idea is that we must drop all reference points, all concepts of what is or what should be. Then it is possible to experience the uniqueness and vividness of phenomena directly. There is tremendous room to experience things, to allow experience to occur and pass away. Movement happens within vast space. Whatever happens, pleasure and pain, birth and death and so forth, are not interfered with. but are experienced in their fullest flavor. Whether they are sweet or sour, they are experienced completely, without philosophical overlays or emotional attitudes to make things seem lovable or presentable. We are never trapped in life because there are constant opportunities for creativity, challenges for improvisation. Ironically, by seeing clearly and acknowledging our egolessness, we may discover that suffering contains bliss, impermanence contains continuity or eternity, and egolessness contains the earth quality of solid being. But this transcendental bliss, continuity, and beingness is not based on fantasies, ideas, or fears. And so with that, we'll bring week 6 to a close. Thank you once again. I wish you a wonderful week of practice. Strongly encourage you to try and practice in the way that Rinpoche suggested, and look forward to seeing you next week. Good evening.